Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Selamünaleyküm, dear Moazzam Begg, and our guests on BİSAK YouTube account. Welcome to our conference. And also, thank you so much, firstly, dear Moazzam Begg, to accepting our invitation. And thank you for all of you attending our conferences, dear audiences and guests. First of all, today we will host Moazzam Begg as a speaker in our program titled Islamophobia and Discrimination, as you know. Let me introduce dear Moazzam Begg firstly, and after that, then I will give the speech to him. He spent most of his life with his works and volunteer projects for Muslims of the world. We'll share with his experiences with us and with the community in this program. At the conference, we expect us to make his post-determinations and future prospects. I hope that it will be beneficial for all of us, inshallah. And now you can begin, dear Moazzam Begg. That's my last words.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulullah. Dear brothers, sisters, friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First of all, it's my pleasure and honor to be addressing you here this afternoon. All the brothers and sisters who've been involved from Boğaziçi University in making this happen. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept your efforts. I have been, as you've rightly said, campaigning for the defense of the rights of Muslims for many, many years now. And first, to go back into a little bit of my story before I speak about Islamophobia and discrimination, is to give you a little bit of my journey here in the United Kingdom, which is where I was born. My parents originate from Pakistan and moved over here to the UK in the 1960s, where I was born and raised. I initially, as a child, went to a Jewish school, so I understood the concept of the importance of the prophets, the importance of belief in one God, the importance of the holy books. So in school, I would learn about that from the Torah, and at home, I would go home and learn from the Quran and the lessons from the Quran and see how the important stories used to match and meet. I also started to discover my identity here as a Muslim because during the 1970s and the 80s, there was a lot of anti-immigrant discrimination, so discrimination against people who were of different backgrounds, particularly in a racist term. So I fought against lots of neo-Nazis who were on the streets, who hated people, black people, brown people, Asian people. But in the midst of all of this, I was searching for an identity. And that search came to probably one of the most important points in my life was when I met refugees that came over from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And these had been victims of the war crimes committed by the Bosnian Serbs. Muslim women who had been gang raped, Muslim men who had had their legs blown off by mines and by bombs and shells, Muslims who had been put into concentration camps, and Muslims who had survived, who had witnessed the genocide in Srebrenica, in Omarska, in Banja Luka, and all of these places in Bosnia, which of course now has become notorious in the world. I joined aid convoys and went over to help those aid convoys and tried to assist in bringing over food, medicine, and aid for these people. But I also understood that the Muslims of Bosnia were being massacred under the eyes, under the watch of the United Nations. So we all know what happened in Srebrenica, how the Muslims were, thousands of Muslims, over 8,000 Muslims were shot and killed with their hands tied behind their back by the forces of Ratko Mladic of the Bosnian Serbs. So I understood that you can't simply just defend these people by giving them food. And the United Nations was watching this happen. Srebrenica, as you know, happened under the Dutch United Nations. So one of the things I did as a result of seeing these atrocities was to join the Armia Bosanska, or the third corpus of the Armia Bosanska, which was known as the Mujahideen, the units of the Mujahideen who fought against the Bosnian Serbs and tried to bring some defense to the Muslims. I was only there for a short period of time, but it had a massive right of self-determination. Back in the United Kingdom, I was interested in trying to reconnect with my Islamic roots. I helped to set up a bookshop that distributed Islamic literature, that helped to teach people about the basics of their religion, to go back to learning the Quran, learning Arabic, learning the seerah, the life of the prophets.
I almost forgot to say that we will take your Q&A end of the speech of dear Moazzam Begg. I'm sorry, your internet connection was destroyed for a few seconds, and I said we will take the questions end of the speech, and you can maintain. Sorry, I disturbed.
Okay, sure. And so in 2001, I moved to Afghanistan with my wife and my children in order to build a project to build schools, to build wells. And we remained there in 2001 until the United States, until the September 11 bombings, and the United States then started to bomb Afghanistan. And we evacuated under these bombs. I went to Pakistan, where I have friends and relatives, and I remained there until the night of the 31st of January 2002. And there was a knock on my door at midnight. And precisely at midnight, when I opened the door, a group of men, no identification, no uniform, they stormed into my house. One of them put a gun straight to my head. They tied my hands behind my back to my legs and pushed me onto the floor on the ground, and then picked me up and carried me in the prone position and took me to the back of the vehicle. In the back of this vehicle, there were two CIA agents dressed as Pakistanis, and they said, you can answer our questions here, or you can answer them in Guantanamo Bay. And so began my journey. This was the journey of being a captive of the United States of America. And the unfortunate thing is that the country that handed me over to the Americans was Pakistan, which is of course a Muslim majority country. And they did it without any legal process. So there was no law involved. There was no rights. There was no protection. It was simply, you have been taken, we've handed you over. America has asked for you, therefore we must oblige. And so then from there, I was sent to another secret location in Pakistan. And then from there, sent to, taken into US military custody. And from US military custody, this is where the abuses, the serious human rights abuses began. And that went on. They took me to a US facility, holding facility in Kandahar. And then from there, after about 6 weeks, to Bagram. And in Bagram, I was there for about 11 months. And then from Bagram, after 11 months, I was sent in February 2003 to Guantanamo. And in Guantanamo, I spent most of my time in solitary confinement in a tiny little cell, 6 foot by, about 2 meters by 1 meter. And after that, I was there for about 2 years, mostly in solitary confinement. And then eventually I was released without charge, without trial, without prosecution, and sent back home on a British military plane back to the United Kingdom. Now that's just the kind of short story, the short part of that period of time, because that's been now quite some time ago. That was from 2002 until 2005. That was only 3 years that I was a captive of the United States of America. Of course, since between then and now, there have been another 15 years. So that's history. And I can talk a little bit about what the Americans were like and that treatment and that process. But I've done that extensively. I've written a book. It's called Enemy Combatant. It's been translated into Turkish also. It's called the Dushman Savaşçı, I think. Savaşçı, which is enemy. Yeah. So it's available if anybody wants to see it or read it. It's available in Turkish bookshops, I know. But the bigger part of my story, really, and that is what I think that concerns you most, is what Islamophobia is like today. Why is it that somebody who'd gone through Guantanamo and that process and had seen what had happened is able to comment on what's happening right now today? Well, first of all, the question we have to ask is this: what is happening today? What's the importance of what's happening today? And let me take you back to last year, when a man called Brenton Tarrant walked into a mosque, into two mosques in Christchurch in New Zealand. And he carried with him several assault rifles. He went on the day of Jummah, on Friday, and he went into two mosques. And he live streamed with a video camera that he had mounted on his head one of the worst atrocities that we've ever seen in modern times. And as he went into the mosque, he started to shoot everybody, those people inside the mosque, those people outside the mosque, people who were running away from him, people running towards him to stop him, men, women, and most shockingly, children, 3 years old, 4 years old, some children in the hands of their parents as they were being killed. Brenton Tarrant, when he did this massacre, was also listening to something, and he was listening to songs. Now, he wasn't listening to English songs. He was listening to songs that were in the language of Serbo-Croat, the language of the Bosnian Serbs. He was listening to songs that praised and glorified Radovan Karadzic. Radovan Karadzic is the convicted war criminal who was in charge of the Bosnian Serbs and gave the orders to Ratko Mladic, who carried out the genocide of the Muslims in Bosnia. Now, this genocide happened in 1995. So that's 25 years ago, a quarter of a century ago. In 1995, nobody used the word Islamophobia. Nobody said about what Islamophobia is. But what's really interesting that we have to understand is that after this genocide, the biggest genocide after what happened to the Jews in World War II, you would have thought that Islamophobia would be something that nobody wants to come anywhere near because already something's terrible has happened. But in fact, what you have found that the language that is being used by people on the far right, this is white, supremacist, nationalist extremists, has been taken over by leaders around the world. So the most powerful leader who, when he came to power, Nazis were celebrating that we have our man in the White House. When he came to power, the Ku Klux Klan, who were responsible for lynching Black people throughout the last century and this century, were saluting and praising him. They were Hitler Nazi Sieg-Heil salutes for Donald Trump when he came into power. When Trump came into power throughout Europe, other far-right organizations like Jobbik in Hungary, like the AfD in Germany, which was the third largest party. It's an anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant party. In Austria, you had somebody from a Nazi belief becoming president. So in Greece, you had the Golden Dawn organization. So throughout the world, anti-Muslim organizations who were far right, on the far right, meaning that they were white supremacists, they believed in the power of white people, came to power. But the problem was that the Bosnians were also white people. The Bosnians who were murdered and butchered in Srebrenica were also white people. But why were they celebrating the murder of these white people? And the reason is because they were Muslims. The reason why Brenton Tarrant was listening to songs that celebrated Radovan Karadzic's murder of those white Muslims is because in the eyes of those people, these people are no longer white. They are, as they see it in their twisted worldview, they are Black. And as Muslims, one of the things that I always found most attractive to me about Islam was the saying of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he said, "La fadlan li Arabiyyin ala ajami," that there is no preference of an Arab over a non-Arab, wala li ajami ala Arab, and that there is no preference of a non-Arab over an Arab, and that wala li ahmarin ala aswad, and there is no preference of a white man over a black man, wala li aswadin ala ahmar, and there is no preference of a black man over a white man, illa bi taqwallah, except the one who has fear of Allah. This was the most beloved thing to me at a time when I was growing up and seeing racism. And it was deeply important to me to look at the stories of the prophets, the companions, and those who were connected to this great religion that now was being targeted by people who saw themselves as supreme over others because of this hatred of extremist nationalism. And as a result, dear brothers and sisters, we've seen, and this is one of the things that I wanted to impart to you, that this message of hatred of Muslims, this Islamophobia, it didn't just happen with the United States of America or Britain or countries that participated in the war on terrorism. Now where Islamophobia exists, you can find that, for example, in India, where the people are brown-skinned, Hindu nationalists, not everybody, of course, but the people in power, Narendra Modi's BJP, they regard Muslims in the same way and use the same terminology that the United States used, that the Bosnian Serbs used against Muslims, and that is, again, in order to oppress them, in order to beat them, to torture them, to abuse them, to violate their rights, and to dispossess them of what they have. Indeed, in Burma, most people have not even heard of the realities in Burma or Myanmar. Aung San Suu Kyi, who was a Nobel Peace Prize winner for bringing in, quote unquote, democracy into Burma, uses the same language to demonize the Rohingya Muslims as everybody else does. The same language they use. They say extremists and terrorists. And once you start to use these labels against Muslims in today's world, that is Islamophobia at state level. You can see indeed, and one of the ironies of all of this, that you know that somebody from the far right ideologically is entirely opposed to somebody from communism or the far left. Yet Brenton Tarrant, the same guy who carried out these killings in these mosques, praises the Chinese communist government for its treatment of the Muslims of East Turkestan, of the Xinjiang province, as it's called. So here you've got somebody from the far right praising a government, a communist government from the far left, because he agrees with the way they treat Muslims by putting them into concentration camps, by forcing them to convert, by forcing them to renounce the Shahada, by forcing them to eat alcohol and to drink pork and to not fast in Ramadan and to not give zakat and to remove the hijab and to demolish masajid and to send people to go and live into the house where a woman is and her husband is being taken off to a concentration camp, to send children to re-education camps, orphanages, even though their parents are alive and are in concentration camps. This is what's being praised by people in the far right. And this is where this Islamophobia, it comes full circle. It comes from Srebrenica and the fact that nobody called it Islamophobia at that time, to now today, where the most powerful man in the world, Donald Trump, says, and I quote, "Islam hates us," even though it doesn't make sense as a grammatical sentence. We know what he means. Now, there is one thing else, brothers and sisters, that's really important for us. Thus far, we've been talking about this level of hatred, this spread. But I want to explain to you Islamophobia now at a state structural level. So, as an example, we'll look at in Britain. We have almost every year a new law passed through the British Parliament that has essentially, de facto, i.e. it doesn't say it in the law, this law is only for Muslims. It will never say that in the written legislature. But in practical application, 99% of these laws almost exclusively apply to the Muslim community. So you have laws where people are detained without charge or trial here in the UK, not Guantanamo, here in the UK. It's happened only to Muslims. In 2001, emergency legislation was passed, and 16 North African and Middle Eastern men were detained under emergency powers. Now remember, brothers and sisters, when we think of emergency powers and emergency legislation and detaining people without charge, perhaps you might think of Syria or Egypt or Libya or countries where there are no human rights. You don't associate that type of behavior with Britain, but it gets worse because these men are then released because the courts, the highest courts find that holding them is against the law, meaning the government's action, what the government has done to these men is illegal. So they're released. Then the government creates new laws, which puts the same men under control orders, and control orders is like house arrest. Now, again, when you think of house arrest, you don't think of Britain as a country of house arrest. You think maybe Burma, but this is happening here. It happens in the UK. Then there are other laws passed about the glorification of terrorism and where people are prosecuted. Remember, now Britain prides itself. It's a country that is deeply proud of its literary traditions. Shakespeare, I'm sure all of you would have heard of William Shakespeare and his famous sonnets, his poems, his short stories that are world renowned. The famous poets like Tennyson and Wordsworth and Robert Burns and so forth. So this is a land of literature. It's a land of freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience. And yet in this country, you have laws like the Glorification of Terrorism Act, where people have been only Muslims. I say it again, only Muslims have been prosecuted for writing books, publishing books, writing poetry. Some of those books were written 100 years ago. Others were written over 1,000 years ago. And those people who have published those books, sometimes that book has to do with jihad, sometimes it has to do with Islamic concepts of the oneness of God or Islamic law and so forth. But in a place that is sure about its beliefs and ideology about democracy and freedom, they found that these books have been a problem. And so they have prosecuted such people simply for books and under terrorism. And if you remember, terrorism is the use of violence for the sake of a political, religious, or ideological goal. Now, most of the crimes that have been created over the past 20 years in Britain to do with terrorism that target Muslims have nothing to do with violence. They are non-violent acts. But for non-violent acts, people are treated as criminals. And as you continue, you find, and I'll give you another example, one of the most insidious laws that we found in the UK have been the Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000. Now, to give you an example, imagine you're traveling, you're flying somewhere, and I've been stopped under this many times, but you're flying to another country and the police, they stop you and they say, we want to question you. And you say, what for? And they say, we don't have to tell you. There's no legal requirement for us to tell you. In fact, you're not even suspected of committing a crime. In fact, you are completely innocent. But because of this law, we can stop you at the airport. We can question you. We can strip search you. We can take your DNA. We can take your photographs. We can take your fingerprints. We can ask you every question we wish to. And if you fail to comply or answer to any of those questions, you can be arrested, prosecuted, and convicted as a terrorist. Now imagine, I said to you first part of this, that you're not even suspected of having committed a crime, but they can convict you at the end of that process as a terrorist. My organization, CAGE, I'm the outreach director for CAGE, and I've been working with it for about 15 years since my release from Guantanamo. And we have submitted a report in which we found, based on evidence gathered from sources like Cambridge University, which said that at just one airport in 2016-17, 88% of those stopped and detained under this law, Schedule 7, were Muslims. Now, bear in mind, Muslims constitute about 5% of the entire population of Britain. Close to 1 million people have been stopped under this law. And you're about 50 times more likely to be stopped under this law if you are somebody who looks, quote unquote, Muslim. There is another law that's been passed in the UK, which was part of the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2015, which made it a legal duty for teachers, nursery attendants, lecturers, doctors, nurses, prison officers to report anybody who they think has the signs of becoming an extremist. And how does somebody who is from a white, non-Muslim English person who has no knowledge or history of studying Islam or the roles or psychology of how a person becomes an extremist, they have no idea. How do they determine what an extremist is? So they've been given markers of what an extremist is. And amongst those things are a young person that is confused, a young person that is unhappy about British foreign policy, a person that is becoming more overtly religious, a person that sees a situation between us and them. And all of these markers, imagine that a teacher sees these things and then they report this stuff to the police. And then the police come and they interview this. And most often the statistics show that the largest number of people targeted under this, A, are Muslims, and B, are children. And many of those are children at primary school. So this, my brothers and sisters, is kind of the situation where we're at in relation to Islamophobia, not just at street level. We know Islamophobia in Britain and across Europe has hit the highest level that it has for many, that it's ever had in its history. There are attacks against Muslim women who wear the hijab. There are attacks either physically or verbally. There's discrimination against Muslims in the workplace. They are less likely to find jobs, less likely to be employed, less likely if somebody finds their name on a job application, it's a Muslim name, that it'll more likely that they'll be discriminated against. All of this stuff is happening. And there are people in powerful advisors to the government, like the Henry Jackson Society, who have said, and I quote, "Conditions for Muslims must be made harder across the board in Europe." Now, bear this in mind again, brothers and sisters. I started off telling you about Srebrenica and about the massacre of Muslims in Bosnia and why I went there. This is being said by some of the most powerful advisors to the governments today, knowing that a genocide took place against Europe's Muslims. Conditions must be made harder for Muslims across the board. Now, I've told you thus far about all of the things that are happening. I haven't told you about all of the things that we're doing to try to fight back. As I said, I work for CAGE, an organization that is an independent advocacy group. We fight for the rights of Muslims, primarily prisoners in Guantanamo, but also around the world, and against Islamophobia, especially at state level, and the laws that have been passed. We campaign for these laws to be abolished, to be scrapped, because we've shown thus far that these laws have not only failed, they've actually made the situation worse, sorry. They've made the situation far worse. Meaning Islamophobia is higher, the threat of terrorism is higher, and the division within society is higher, and the hatred in society is higher. And whilst we have racists on the streets who enact that hatred, the politicians in power are the ones who give it legal cover and allow that to spread. So we have been giving the voice to all of the people that's reach out to us who've suffered under these various laws and legislation, whether they've been kidnapped by United States agents and sent off to secret prisons and been tortured like I was, and other people, whether it's prisoners in Guantanamo who are held there without charge or trial by the United States for almost 20 years, whether it's a young child who gets referred by his school teacher to the Prevent program because he said, when I grow up, I want to be like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. He has a t-shirt that says that. But when his teacher sees Abu Bakr, the only Abu Bakr they know is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the bogus fake caliph of the Islamic State group. We look at people and defend people and campaign for people who've been detained under Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act at airports and tell them the rights they have. They have a right to a lawyer. They have a right to know what it is that they're being stopped for. They have a right to seek, at least to see the details of the conversation that the police have had with them. We tell people about what to do if the security services come and question you and what rights you have there. And most importantly, brothers and sisters, I have spent the past 15 years giving evidence to the British Parliament, to the British police, to an independent inquiry led by judges, to the International Criminal Court, and even to a war crimes tribunal in Malaysia. And all of this was to do with the role of the British government and the United States government in torture, kidnap, abduction, false imprisonment, and in the worst cases, death, murder. Now, inshallah, I'm going to end on this note. Two notes I'm going to end on. One is, I didn't go into the detail of Bagram and Guantanamo because, as I said, I've gone through all of that. And if you are interested, the book, there's three things, three sort of resources you can look at. One is, as I said, there's a book. In English, it's called Enemy Combatant. In Turkish, Dushman Savaşçı. There's also a film called The Confession, made by the British Film Institute. And it's about my experience of the war on terror. It's called Living the War on Terror. And it's about that 20-year journey of what's happened over these years. And of course, as I said, if you go to the website, cage.ngo, you'll find all of the work that I was talking about. There are two things that I wanted to end on. One is a bad note and one is a good note. So I'll give you the bad one first. In Bagram, I was, in 2002, I saw American soldiers bring in a prisoner, and his name was Dilawar. He was an Afghan taxi driver. And they brought him to the front of the cell where I was. It was a communal mixed cell where there was about 10 of us. They tied him to the top of the door. They tied his hands like this, and they suspended them, left his hands suspended with the shackles cutting into his wrists, and they put a hood over his head. They kept him like that for days. And eventually he was like this, and he just dropped, his head dropped and his body slumped. So they opened the door and they started to punch him. Instead of giving him medical treatment, they started to punch him and punch him and punch him. And then they took his body away. And that night he died. And I was a witness to his murder. And his murder was committed by American soldiers in uniform, uniformed American soldiers. And I promised the Americans that no matter what happens, whenever I leave this place, I will never let you forget what you did to this man. And I will tell the whole world what you did. They made a film in 2008. It's called Taxi to the Dark Side. It won the Oscar for Best Documentary in 2008. And it's all about this person, Dilawar, the taxi driver, how they murdered an innocent man. And the reason why they murdered him is, in the end, I found out that when they took him up to the top cell, he was still alive. They hung him up again and they kicked him on his leg over 100 times. And the reason why they kicked him on his leg is because they found it amusing that every time they kicked him, he said, Allah, Allah. So every time they kicked him in his leg, he said, Allah, Allah. And they found it amusing. They wanted to see if he says, Allah, Allah more. And they kicked him to the point at which he said, Allah, Allah, over 200 times. And the autopsy report said that his leg, if he survived, which he didn't, would have required an amputation. And it looked like a truck had run over his leg. So that's the story of Dilawar. Now, it's important that I tell you, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا كُونُوا قَوَّامِينَ لِلَّهِ شُهَدَاءَ بِالْقِسْطِ وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنَ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا اعْدِلُوا هُوَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى. O you who believe, stand up as just witnesses for Allah, and do not allow your animosity of the people to cause you to swerve from justice, to cause you to do them an injustice. Be just, اعْدِلُوا هُوَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى. Be just, that is closer to God consciousness. In my time at Guantanamo and Bagram and Kandahar, and as a prisoner of the United States, I came across many soldiers who were involved in terrible abuses against us. And I'm not going to go into that detail. But I also came across many soldiers who were decent, good people, who would bring information about what's happening, who would sometimes sneak in a little chocolate, a little sweet, a little piece of food, a little piece of information, sometimes a film, anything they could do to make our life easier, which they did at the risk of being prosecuted for fraternization with the enemy. And these soldiers, alhamdulillah, some of them remained my friends. A couple of them took their shahada, accepted Islam after they left. And as I said, some of them have visited me in my house and remain my friends today. And this is the most important message for me, to you in particular, is that we never, to me, the famous saying of Umar al-Mukhtar, who fought the Italian occupiers, the famous mujahid who fought the Italian occupiers, is that he said about his oppressors that they are not our teachers. And this is something that I've always independently believed too, is that my oppressor, my abuser, my torturer, my enemy is not my teacher. My teacher is the Prophet, rahmatan lil alameen, mercy unto mankind, and his companions. They were strong in the face of oppression. They didn't back down. They didn't bow their heads. La darar wa la dirar. Don't harm and don't be harmed. La tadlimuna wa la tudlamun. Do not oppress and do not be oppressed. And so they are our teachers. And in conclusion, I would say this, that the message that I have for everyone is the message of the justice of Islam, the equality of Islam, and in the face of the worst onslaught that we have seen in modern times, that we hold on to our faith and that we ensure that our oppressors do not become our teachers. وجزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. And inshallah, we can take questions from now.
Thank you for your speech, first of all. And then we can begin to the Q&A part. And our guests, you can ask your questions on the comments part. And first of all, I would like to read one of the questions.
Sure.
Okay. Do you believe there is a future for Muslim in the UK? And what does he think about the effect of multi-generational dawah by the British government or prevent will have on Muslims ultimately?
Sorry, could you repeat that question? I didn't hear it properly. I know I heard something about prevent, but I didn't hear it properly.
Oh, okay. I will tell again. Can you hear now me?
Yes.
Okay. Do you believe there is a future for Muslim in the UK? And what does he think about the effect of multi-generational dawah by the British government's prevent will have on Muslims ultimately?
Okay, it's a very good question. Is there a future for Muslims in the UK? Ultimately, I say there's at least in the UK, there are probably 4 or maybe 5 odd million Muslims. There is nowhere else to go to be safe. Maybe over a long period of time, if things get worse over here, that's possible. But right now, just as somebody who's speaking to you, I'm born and raised in this country. I'm 52 years old and I'm British. I'm Muslim, but I'm British. Very British in how I speak to you, in how I eat, in how I talk, how I walk. That's just how we are. The same is true of French Muslims, the French Muslims or the Spanish Muslims or the German Muslims, that they have been there now for generations. So there is a future as long as we are not thrown out of the country. But where there is fear is that we are being singled out as Muslims. So my view and the view of my organization is that we have to stand and fight here, stand and fight for our rights. If the government tries to force through legislation, then we have to show how that legislation has two things. One, it is a failure, and two, it is unnecessary. And I think that we have been successful in the first part, in that showing it that these legislations are an entire failure and is part of the problem of Islamophobia. So the future is going to be a tough one. It's not going to be an easy one. I have no doubts about that. And that will, whoever gets affected by that will have to carry the banner for Muslims to defend Islam and or give up. And when they give up, that means giving up aspects of your faith that actually identify who you are.
Okay, second question is somewhat similar. The Muslim youth, especially in Muslim majority countries, are really interested about what's going on in Western countries like the US or the UK, and how the Muslim communities engage with each other in terms of, like, defending Islamic identity and the Islamic values. And one of the aspects of it is, like you said, combating the extremism and Islamophobia, like alt-right extremism and discrimination against Muslims. But there's also an observation that primarily revolves around some Muslim communities in UK and the US allying themselves with pro-leftist organizations so that they could allegedly combat the alt-right discrimination against Muslims, which most of the Muslims in the Middle Eastern countries find somewhat disappointing. Do you think that there could be a middle way to have in that problem?
Yeah, well, that is a very, very good question. And, I one of the ones who would say that I've also been involved in allying with some aspects of the left in trying to defeat Islamophobia. Now, we have to recognize help when it's come. For example, some of the people from the left have stood with us in the fight against the invasion of Iraq, in the fight against Islamophobia, in the fight to bring back prisoners from Guantanamo to get them released. And so that has been one of the positives of working with the left. However, and there's a big problem, the biggest fault lines we've found in recent times have been over two issues. One is Syria and the other is China. And in those places, we found that the left have been silent and B, worse, complicit. So we found some within the left, many within the left that will either be silent or support the Assad regime and what it has done against Muslims in Syria by using the same language of the right. So Assad calls the opponents who opposed him in Syria, he calls them terrorists. And he does that to try and get Western support. And so the West call them terrorists. So Russia calls them terrorists, and Assad calls them terrorists, but nobody calls a person that carries out genocide against his own people, that kills them by barrel bombs, by vacuum bombs, by chemical weapons, starvation, rape, and so forth. No, that's not terrorism. The other place, of course, that we've seen this is China. The Chinese government does exactly the same thing, puts Muslims into concentration camps and calls them extremists and terrorists. The Muslims, we have to find our own place. And that is sometimes we are allied with, we have alliances with the left and sometimes with the right and sometimes with none. But we are a minority. And by definition, a minority needs support from somewhere. Our ultimate aim is to get the support from the Muslim world and to have our unique link with the Muslim world. But in the absence of that, we will be forced to take alliances. And we fully recognize the dangers of being completely allied to the left or to the right.
Thank you. I think there's another question.
Okay, I will go another question, which is about Hagia Sophia. Maybe you heard about it. Turkey had a museum, which is Hagia Sophia Museum, and now, alhamdulillah, it changed by Hagia Sophia Mosque. And what's your view on people who live in the UK or the US or European citizens? The question was for Muslim people. Yeah, it was for Muslim people. What's their idea about this topic?
My view has been, I remember when I went to Hagia Sophia a few years ago, and every time I go there, I wonder why is the mosque, and that it had been a mosque for hundreds of years after Muhammad al-Fatih conquered Constantinople, and it was only converted in the last century to a museum. And the people's argument is that, well, the Blue Mosque is just very close by, so why do you need another mosque? The point isn't about whether you need another mosque or not. The point is, why was it converted to a museum in the first place? And that this was a mosque. From the point that the Turks took it over, since the Ottomans took it over, it has been a mosque. And I think that all that has happened is that it has been resettled, that this is, this thing that took place 90 odd years ago was a mistake. It was wrong. It should never have been converted into a museum. That's my personal view. My understanding is that the Ottomans, the Turks, have always preserved, far better than others, in fact, the grace of the Hagia Sophia. They didn't deface the imagery, the icons of Christianity. They simply covered them up with tiles in a very respectful way. They rebuilt the parts of the mosque or the cathedral that had been destroyed during the crusade, the Fourth Crusade, where the Crusaders, before they even came to the Muslim lands, actually destroyed Constantinople and took the gold and took possessions from Hagia Sophia. So, and it was in a dilapidated state by the time that the Ottomans had taken over, and they rebuilt the place and have maintained its magnificence as a result. And this hasn't been the case. Some people will argue and say, well, you know, that allows Hindus to destroy mosques and so forth. Well, I'm sorry, they didn't destroy it. They built it and they looked after it and took care of it. And this was a conquest. And there are many mosques that were converted and destroyed, which I've seen with my own eyes in different parts of the old Ottoman Empire, in Greece, in Bosnia, in other places, that they were not given that respect. So I think this is not an issue for us to be concerned. And having seen tens of thousands of people praying in that mosque, I have to say it gave me a great deal of joy that happened.
Okay, thank you for coming to our conference, and we don't have more questions. Then we can finish our conference. And thank you for our guests for attending our conference, and you. We are so pleasure for coming there.
Jazakallah khair, my pleasure, and my salam to all of you at the university. And I pray Allah makes this a better work for all of us, inshallah.
Thank you so much. And one more question just came. I will ask it, and after that we can finish. Is it okay for you?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I'm reading the question. Do you face with Islamophobia from born Muslims? We have too much Islamophobia from Turks in Turkey. How to deal with it? That's the question.
Oh, that's a question for Turkish scholars to answer. I don't know how do you deal with Islamophobia. I mean, one of the things we have to understand that there is Islamophobia from people who claim to be Muslims. People who claim to be Muslims can be Islamophobic. And the only thing I can say to this is that each person who has a problem with Islam, whether it's, if you're a Muslim who has a problem with Islam, then you need to check yourself. You need to reconfigure your heart and say, if you are a Muslim, then you must live as a Muslim and hopefully die as a Muslim. You can't claim to have one foot in Islam and one foot in disbelief, let's say. You either are a Muslim or you're not. And if you are a Muslim, one of the verses of the Quran that's most important to you is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَا وَرَبِّكَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ حَتَّى يُحَكِّمُوكَ فِي مَا شَجَرَ بَيْنَهُمْ ثُمَّ لَا يَجِدُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَرَجًا مِمَّا قَضَيْتَ وَيُسَلِّمُوا تَسْلِيمًا. By your Lord, they will never believe until they take you, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Allah as a judge in what they dispute in which they dispute between themselves. And then they find no dislike in their hearts for whatever that judgment is, and they submit completely, wholeheartedly. And that's why we're called Muslims, my dear brothers. Other Muslims who have a problem with submitting to Islam, we're called Muslims because we submit. We're not called Muslims like Christians are followers of Christ or Christianity. Jews are followers of Judaism. Islam is not an ism. Islam itself means submission. And we submit to the will, to the law, to the word, to the spirit of the deed of the Quran. And that's what makes us Muslim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَسَمَّاكُمْ مُسْلِمِينَ, that He has named you Muslims. And the word Muslim means one who submits. So if you, as a Muslim who oppose Muslims who seek to gain power for Islam, and you have a problem with that, then you have a problem with your submission. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide the hearts of those who have a problem with submitting.
Thank you so much, your all of answers and your speech. And as I mentioned before, we can finish our program. Thank you for all of people, our guests. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.